So hello everyone that's watching on a replay. I had did a little bit of talking for a few minutes like I often do before hitting record. So a lot of interest today, a lot of signups actually. I had no idea how interested people would be because granted evolution isn't like, like the #1 issue, that practically speaking might be on our minds. But it's interesting for for a few reasons, if it is interesting to you, and certainly the widespread cultural phenomenon of treating it like it's true and obviously true, and you're an idiot if you don't think that it's true is fascinating if it's false, right? And then that might give us like an insight into things where we all, our theory of mind, including our theory of other people's minds, including our theory of how people come to conclusions, what people's experiences are like, what they want, right? This is super important in our daily lives, in our business life, in our personal life, is our theory of mind, our theory of, are they trying? Oh, they should have thought of this, they should have done that, so I'm gonna be upset at them, I'm gonna punish them. And of course, our theory of our own minds, right? Like often people don't think of theory of mind explicitly, but we use our own theory of mind nonstop, and it's of extreme practical importance in like everything we do, including sex and money, right? That's kind of the two most important things, so to speak, for a lot of us, and including myself on kind of a earthly practical level. Of course, overall, I want goodness and people to choose to have a relationship with God, including myself, and that's what ultimately matters. But then, in terms of quality of life on Earth, then there's also just, love and money. So evolution is a very interesting case study when it comes to a part of a theory of mind and other people's minds and so forth. Jarvis says, so happy to be here. I've been doing classical conversations with my kids for 6 or 7 years, and I'd like to explain and understand this accurately. Oh, that's so great. And have you heard, you're probably responding to how I mentioned that Chance, my son, is doing classical conversations. We just started about a year ago. And it's awesome. We have a particularly great community, it seems, here in South Franklin in Tennessee, and it's exciting. And just to give some perspectives here, so with Lawrence, you can really still feel like evolution feels correct, although you understand from following me for a while that I might be right about it being wrong, and you're interested in what you have to hear. Denise is kind of interested, as I expect a number of people to be, in being able to explain better to other people. Not that we're going to be able to change people's minds who are, going to be, people can always just kind of, like, in order to kind of, you can convince someone through all sorts of, personality-based, sales-based things, but in order to like lead someone through to a different understanding, like to a paradigm shift, you can help them with this, but they have to grab hold of an idea and keep it still and keep comparing with it. And what you're going to find people's minds do, and just to be aware of this and used to it, so it doesn't really frustrate you, but you kind of come to expect it, is that instead what people's minds will do is just jump around and be like, well, what about this? But what about that? And they'll switch the meanings of things, and they won't. And you try to bring them back. It's like redirecting a child. Sort of. You try to bring them back to, but hold on, here's an idea, and we're trying to keep this consistent, and then compare things with it and build with it, right? Because that's the only way to think accurately, and it's the only way to figure yourself out through a paradigm shift, right? Like, to pick something random, like with Abraham Lincoln, right? Like, we're told the people's views in America and whoever else thinks about Abraham Lincoln around the world are generally that he was a great, heroic, good man and a good president. But one day I just sort of worked through just holding ideas consistent, and he's basically extremely similar to what we're seeing play out with Putin, right? I mean, he invaded a foreign country because they had bad people in them, and enslaved, conscripted. The biggest thing was he enslaved boys up in the north. If they couldn't pay $300, they were conscripted. And so I just walked through that, and it's just an example, a random example of keeping an idea consistent, like enslaving people, in this case, young boys in the north. Enslaving people, that's bad, right? But wait, is it the same as generational slavery? Well, it doesn't really matter whether it's the same, worse, or whatever. Every crime or bad thing doesn't have to be just as bad as another, right? If one person, sorry to use the example, but brutally rapes a person, another person rapes a little less brutally, that's still bad, even though it could have been even worse, right? So, and it's kind of gets arguable whether something's worse than enslaving a kid, making him walk hundreds of miles with bad footgear, having him stand in front of cannons, get stabbed with bayonets, kill other people, et cetera, right? So just by keeping that one idea consistent, like slavery is like really, really bad, and he did that, and then wait a second, he just invaded another, doesn't matter if it's a country or not, he just invaded people's homes and land and houses and just utterly decimated them and killed civilians and you know, with generals and so forth, especially toward the end with Sherman's march. It was just terrible. And so he's almost identical to, you know, Putin. Yes, there was a great consequence, which was, there was a number of terrible consequences, but one great consequence of freeing other people's slaves. But then, anyway, I'm not trying to argue one way or the other about Lincoln, but by keeping an idea constant, it can be shocking where you can get to. But and realizing how that isn't how people's minds work generally, and how something can be kind of simple, or a paradigm shift can be easy and obvious if and only if you're able to keep an idea constant and work with it. And yet someone could just never grasp it because their mind just keeps bouncing around to kind of different random, seemingly related things. And being able to tell the difference of keeping an idea constant or not is a huge difference in ability, skill. It just can open up whole new worlds, you know, in life, so to speak. And then also realizing when people can be smart, right? Like professors and the belief in evolution turns out to be stupid, and I don't mean that insultingly. If you know, as Lawrence said, he could be feeling like it's true. But as we keep ideas constant and work it through, it turns out to be stupid in and of itself, like its own thing. But people aren't, it's not that people are smart or stupid, right? They can be clever and do smart things, but it's going to depend so much on understanding that people think by analogy, and basically we can call it thinking inside or outside the box, but even more specifically, people use, like I talked about previously, mental objects and analogies to think. Metaphors, ways of picturing things. When we'll see with natural selection and so forth, people will have these mental pictures and metaphors, analogies that they use. Science itself is a way of discovering and thinking via analogy. So science, the scientific method works as long as, first of all, the past is analogous to the present, and also as long as we're tight with our analogies, right? Like the idea of a double-blind study or being careful with your measurements, right? If you're not careful with your measurements, then what's happening is you're messing with your analogies, because one thing is not like another thing if your measurements are off. Now that difference between one thing not being like another thing may or may not be relevant, right? But sometimes it's very relevant. And if it is, right, if the screw up within your analogy, right, if you're saying one thing is like another, but it's dissimilar in a way that really matters, then you're going to be, you know, wildly off. And so thinking by analogy can sometimes get us very far. It can be the way to go. It can be great, right? Science can deliver the scientific method can deliver all sorts of things. And then of course we can just glom the word onto science stuff, like we've seen recently with the whole COVID thing, right? Plenty of actual useful science went into things with COVID, molecular biology and so forth, you know, could be very relevant and correct based on science and based on analogy. Like here's a virus in one person or in many people. We're going to assume that the virus is similar enough, or in other people, that making a vaccine is going to help. And lo and behold, as far as I can tell, the hospitalization rate and death rate is, you know, way down with the vaccine. However, the idea of like 6-foot social distancing, there's a certain common sense to, like, if you're going to be in choir practice with somebody else, then that has COVID, it seems like that got spread that way, right? So certainly being in a closed space for a decent amount of time with someone who's exhaling a lot is going to do something. But the 6-foot, if I have my facts right, which I may not ever have my facts right, but I think it was just a conjecture of some guy in the late 1800s about some other disease that's 6 foot, and it just kind of caught on. So that's not science, right? The word science can be used for things. We'll see that with evolution too. Okay, so let's go straight to evolution. All right, I have one slide here that will kind of contain 4 major ideas that, as we understand them, that can kind of clear things up, right? It's not really, I'm not making a case against evolution, right? Something like whether Jesus was the Son of God is the kind of thing that lends itself to making a case, kind of looking at evidence and so forth. I saw it with Lee Strobel wrote, The Case for Christ, and it was quite a good book. He was a crime reporter, and his wife became a Christian. He was not a Christian, and then he looked into it, and then he wrote this book and so forth. But then he wrote a book on the case for faith, which I think was like kind of a case for God's existence. That's not really something you make a case for. I didn't make a case for God's existence. I showed you how to dissolve problems in contradictions and wrong ways of understanding things, have the right tools, and then you understand accurately. Like, you don't make a case that 3 + 8 = 11. You just need someone to understand the concepts involved accurately enough so that if they're getting it wrong, they just need to keep having more clarity on the critical concepts of like plus, numbers like 3 and 8 and ones and adding ones and equals, right? Those things. And if you understand all the concepts involved, like I just said, plus and the numbers and equals, then you'll come to a clarity on 3 + 8 = 11. Someone could add numbers up wrong, but someone else could correct them. And when you have enough clarity, you're going to get it right. And there's also a correction mechanism that kind of works, right, with math, where people can correct each other and so forth. When it comes to evolutionary theory, then we don't need to make a case for it. It's the type of thing where we can know one way or the other. All right, so let's take a look here. Now, I can't really treat these concepts independently, so I'm going to have to do some form of either skipping around or referring or kind of talking about all of them in a sort of at once. Obviously, in a sentence, I might talk about just one of them, but I have to kind of interweave. Okay, so first, let's just understand what the theory of evolution not only is, but has to be. And we also kind of have to see like where it's going or what it's trying to do, right? Because it's treated by people like it does a lot, and I agree. Like it serves a function, it changes people's mind about something, and then what is that? And evolutionists will say that like nothing makes sense in biology except in light of evolutionary theory. Like it's just this wonderful theory that makes sense out of things, and everything's kind of nonsense without it. So that's what I mean by it's doing something. So we'll try to get a sense of what is it that it's doing or that people feel like it needs to do or whatever. But it has to be 2 things. And when I say it has to be, I'll try to explain what I mean by that. If someone, for example, if someone were to say, I can't believe, like if a creationist type person were to say, I can't believe that an evolutionist thinks that all of this diversity and complexity in life could happen by chance, then what would the first thing an evolutionist would respond, in essence correctly, would be, well, no, evolutionary theory is not just that chance created stuff, it's chance and necessity, as Jacques Monod put it, an evolutionist in France, and just kind of caught on as kind of a catchphrase. It's not, there's an appearance of like purpose or design or something, but that you don't just like open a combination lock by chance, you do it through a process that involves a sort of necessity, right? And there's a driving force. There's like raw material of chance, so to speak, or nature throws up variation, as they might say, because one of the things you'll notice as you have the distinction for it is that evolutionists somehow need to kind of constantly anthropomorphize nature and talk about nature does this, nature does that, nature's clever about this, nature designed this. Oop, I mean, it did but didn't do it. And they'll say, of course, I don't mean that it actually did it. But the weird thing is they keep needing to say that nature does things and how clever nature is and all that. And then they'll have a disclaimer, but they can't really find any way to phrase it except for anthropomorphizing nature, because it's so actually impossible to rip the purpose out of nature or out of existence and our lives and everything we know, as I'll also try to cover, that you end up talking as if there's purpose and then just disclaiming that, oh no, of course there isn't, and blah, blah, but it's such an absurdity that you end up kind of going in circles. So the beauty of evolution to someone that is wrong about it, but kind of in their mind, like the point of it is to someone might have an objection to this, but I'll anyway, is to kind of rip the purpose out of existence, nature, right, and so forth. And it's to show that it's kind of can be can be explained through natural laws, right? You don't need to insert like a Deus ex machina, God by machine, like a God, or just like it can be disconcerting to just be, oh, there's a miracle here, a miracle there. We can't depend on science, basically, right? We just have to kind of put in God and miracles, and it just doesn't sit right with many people. And so so it seems elegant and critical to show how it could just happen. It'd be like if someone just said, well, a ghost did this, a ghost makes my car run, and lots of people would say, well, that isn't very helpful, right? Or a ghost committed this murder. You'd say, well, actually, I want to figure out who actually committed the murder, and not just say a ghost did it, right? Because then we can prevent maybe future murders and so forth, right? So there's an understandable drive to have an explanation of things, just like, or if it rains because the gods are angry and then we need to make sacrifices or to the gods to appease them, then that's not a very helpful worldview, right? And so an evolutionist, understandably, would be thinking along those lines, is we want to get the superstition out of it, we want to get the unuseful gods are angry, so it's thunderstorming, or there's no rain, or there is rain, or whatever, right? And we want to understand the world, and how does it help us understand the world if creationists are just saying, well, God does this, God does that, and we can't really predict it, or or whatever. So it seems beautiful and elegant to give an explanation similar to if you can explain the weather, even if in one sense the weather is hard to predict. I affirm that it's pretty great and useful to not think that we have to sacrifice children in order to make it rain, right? Or even do a rain dance or whatever, is to understand how these things work and to predict when there might be a volcano or even just whatever weather, so we can, or blizzards or whatever, right? So that, predict, help us travel and so forth, and knowing when to plant crops and things like that. Now, it turns out that as opposed to the weather, there aren't useful predictions made by macroevolution. There's a complaint made by evolutionists towards their critics that, well, there's no difference in kind between microevolution and macroevolution, right? Like one's just evolution on a smaller scale, one's on a larger scale. It turns out there is a difference in kind. There's a qualitative difference between the type of evolution that actually does happen, right? With Omicron variant of COVID comes out, then that's an example of a type of evolution. And that was not choreographed by God or created by a miracle, as far as we need to know. It is any more than saying that when it rained yesterday, it was God doing it, right? Of course, God creates everything every moment, as I talked about in the previous. Of course, if you watch my previous series and followed it on God's existence, right? God has to create everything in your consciousness field at every consciousness screen at every moment, like everything in your consciousness screen at all times has to be created by God anew. So God does create everything, but there's a separate question of God choreographing things, right? Like my grandma, who is a strong believer in God and evangelical, she, like many, would make the mistake, kind of how they talked in the Old Testament too, but she would make the mistake of, like, if I made money with like a stock trade, then she would be like, well, thank God for that. Well, I was like, well, what do I say to God if I lose money in a stock trade, right? So God isn't choreographing a lot of stuff, right? If God was, then that would legitimize or be an issue for people that say, well, why is there evil, right? So when it comes to macroevolution or microevolution, one of the questions is, what's God choreographing? That question is a good and useful question, but it's only a question that people that understand that God exists and how things fundamentally work can ask in the first place. In real life and practice, evolutionists are more interested in ripping the purpose out of nature. Or there's plenty of theistic evolutionists that just say, well, I just think the evidence is in favor of evolution, and why couldn't God work through evolution? And I get that. And with those people, they just don't understand the facts. It may or may not be that important, except that as a cultural phenomenon, because it's so wrong, it's just kind of worthwhile to know that it's not accurate. Much like young Earth creationism is very wrong. It just isn't correct. It's wildly against facts. Is the idea that the Earth is like 4,000 or 10,000 years old. The Earth is quite clearly about 4.6 billion years old. Now, that's a sort of a factual thing. That is something where there's more of a case to be made, and that's not really where I try to hang my hat, right? It's just that at some point, things like if I say that there wasn't a massive volcanic eruption in New York City yesterday, then we still need to be able to say, yeah, that's correct. There wasn't. Like what I'm talking about history, it happened yesterday. It's a fact. Maybe the news, we don't trust the news these days, right? We could say, oh, well, I don't know, the news doesn't tell us the truth, right? But realistically, at some point, there's science and there's facts within, some reason that we can talk about. All right. So evolution does and has to involve two things. And what I'm saying isn't really controversial in terms of what evolutionists would say or anything. So I'm just kind of identifying both what they're saying, but also pointing out that it kind of has to be what they're saying. And so they can't really change the story halfway through. So the idea of evolution, there was kind of the Darwinian idea pre-understanding heredity and DNA, when he just kind of looked around, saw a bunch of finches or mockingbirds and so forth in the Galapagos Islands, let's say. And some had shorter beaks, some had longer beaks, right? And the shorter beaks helped them maybe when it was one of the types of beaks helped them, crack maybe the tougher nuts that would happen if there's a drought or some such, right? I might have it backwards, but you get the idea. Depending on rain conditions, having a longer or shorter beak could be helpful or not helpful for eating and potentially therefore for survival. And so based on that and whatever other ideas Darwin had in his mind, he had this idea that nature threw up, that there was clearly variation just happened without a kind of as the natural course of things, just like rocks fall from high places and because of gravity, right, and shatter on the ground. It isn't like God decided to push the rock or push the rock downward, so to speak. We think of it in terms of natural laws. So naturally, Darwin noticed that there's this variation, right, in nature, and then he had this idea that people call survival of the fittest, right? And he probably used that exact term, but regardless. So, and the idea is that only that there's more babies than can grow to adulthood and reproduce, right? And then so naturally, like out of the variation that occurs, you're of course going to have the organisms that are best suited, people say, for survival. But here, one of the super critical things that will clear up so much of the issues with evolution is being clear and specific and having a mental object for natural selection that's accurate and that doesn't change. So there's a change that keeps happening conceptually in people's minds as they think about evolution and regarding natural selection, right? They don't really have too much of an issue regarding mutation and variation. There's some. There's a pretty significant one there too, actually. There's kind of, I guess we could say, two major places where there's this kind of equivocation, this wobble in people's mental object for what the word and the concept is, and it wobbles one way or the other way, and that is why evolution seems to make sense in a sense. So with natural selection, what it is this idea of something being advantageous for survival versus how I put it is having more grandkids. And it's hard to grasp, it's hard to keep in our minds something because it's so absurd. but it's integral to the theory of evolution. And it's very clearly affirmed by evolutionists, like universally, because it kind of has to be, is that there's no purpose in nature, meaning that natural selection is not a function of finches wanting to evolve and wanting to make improvements to themselves and therefore improving themselves and surviving better. It's not that even any individual finch is like trying to have more grandkids or trying to survive, trying to be more fit. It's just that it happens like a force. Like a good way to see this is like if a rock falls from a high place to the ground, right? We think of that in terms of gravity happening. We don't think of it in terms of the rock feeling a sense of purpose to get closer to the ground and trying to get down and maybe smashing on the ground into pieces, like it wanted to do that, right? So the gravity isn't something where objects that are higher up are striving and wanting and purposely trying to get lower, right? And that's how natural selection is it's like a force in nature, but not really a force. It's more of a phenomenon, or it's kind of like a bit of a logical idea also, right? So it's weird. There isn't an actual force, but it sort of flows in evolutionist mind as a certain logic. And it does, with certain careful premises, it's a correct logical phenomenon. And right, so the idea is that that whoever, these are my words, but I'll show how it's accurate. Whoever has the most grandkids, that's, in essence, once again, it's easy to say even that's who natural selection favors, but natural selection doesn't exist to favor anything. We really want to stop with all the intention. Try to talk about evolution without using intentional language and then like trying to walk it back with an asterisk later, and you'll find that you pretty much can't do it, but you have to, you need to try, and you need to actually succeed if you're going to talk about evolution as if it's true, and like you just can't put intentional language. So natural selection is not a force. Evolutionists would agree, like have to affirm this, like they basically would or do. It's not a force like gravity. Even gravity is not a force, it's a regulation in how God does things. But even natural selection isn't even really a regulation in how God does things. It's more of a logical necessity when you set up certain parameters, right? Is all right if a population of finches, if they're going to have 100,000 kids, but there's only enough food for 10,000 of them, or one way or another, only 10,000 of them are going to reproduce because of some combination of limited food and predators and whatever else might be similar to that, right? And this is what the only thing natural selection can be. And again, it's not actually a force. It's more of a phenomenon, like a logical phenomenon. Like if you add two even numbers, you're going to get an even number, right? Like 2 + 4 = 6, right? You can't ever add two even numbers and get an odd number, right? Like no two even numbers are ever going to add up to 7 or 9 or whatever, right? Or 100. Even if we made a long number that we could instantly see whether that if I gave you a 10-digit number that was even, another 10-digit number that was even, and then I said, does it equal? And I gave you another long number that was odd, you would know that they didn't add up to that odd number. It couldn't be. Or even if it's hard to add them up quickly yourself, it couldn't be that. Okay, so that's not because there's a force in the world forcing even numbers to not add up to odd numbers, right? It's a logical phenomenon based on how you set the parameters or how you define things. And that's how natural selection is. And again, evolutionists would have to affirm this, right? Like the idea that it's a force is just kind of nonsense, right? So it's a logical phenomenon. So that's what we're dealing with, is it's only about who has more grandkids. Without that pseudo force, and it also is unintentional, it's not purposeful. Nothing nothing evolves in order to survive or in order to have more kids. They just end up having kids and more kids. And that would sort things out. It would, in retrospect, it might look designed or intentional, but there was no purpose. And I'm explaining evolutionary theory, and I'm not objecting to it. I'm explaining the theory itself, right? All one has to really do is understand the theory itself properly, and it dissolves. Okay, but I'm not twisting the theory here. I'm not even saying anything that's controversial at this point. I'm just explaining accurately evolutionary theory, right? So again, there's no force, but there's this natural selection that can kind of look like a force, kind of looking back on it. Okay. So it depends on this variety happening, right? Which is the chance part, right? Without any variety, if every organism reproduced exactly identical copies of itself, then we also wouldn't have evolution. I know I didn't talk about the difference between microevolution and macroevolution, but for the moment, let's just only think about evolution as in the macro theory, and then I could talk about the micro theory. Of course, in a different way, it does happen. I'll refer again. There's a lot of threads that kind of have to, or a few threads at least, that have to be kind of, or ideally would be said all at once or all at the beginning. The fundamental difference is that you like if you have COVID and it keeps multiplying, there's going to be variations, of course, in the copying of its DNA, or almost all it is DNA, right? That gets a protein coat made over itself, probably is a virus. And the same would be true about if it was a bacteria or something. Then of course, it replicates, and there's going to be variation, and any variation that, of course, that ends up making it better able to have grandkids, right? Either by better overcoming things that would kill it, and or by reproducing kind of faster in a way that wasn't detrimental to having kids in some other way. But again, if it has more grandkids, then that is a naturally selected for. That means it was naturally selected for. Does that mean? Now again, it doesn't mean that natural selection works on it. It means that if it has more in essence, if it has more grandkids, it has more grandkids, right? And if it has a lot more grandkids, it'll basically crowd out the other populations, right, of COVID, which is kind of what Omicron did. In what might have been a helpful way, because it was more, it was weaker in other ways, which is predictable. And that's where microevolution is a very useful, important theory, and it actually can make predictions. And it was a prediction, and should have been a prediction, that you over time get strains of viruses or bacteria that reproduce better. They're selected for, but they're actually less deadly, because first of all, that is better for them to have grandkids, right? Like the more your host organism survives, the better off you are, actually, if you're a parasite, right? And you the other thing is that you tend to just get more broken over time. What's happening is mostly things are getting broken when you are microevolving. You're not really gaining new things. You're essentially breaking them. I'm going to have to say that briefly for now instead of getting too much into it. But that's going to turn out to be the essential difference there. There could be more said about that. It doesn't have to be exactly only that. But that encapsulates a lot of what's going on. There's like if you're copying a book and there's copying errors, like War and Peace, right, or whatever book, Harry Potter's first book, right? I don't know if that was the Deathly Hallows, I can't remember, but it was called Harry Potter. So if you copy Harry Potter and you somehow have copying errors, and somehow there's an idea that all of the copies can't get bought, and so you have some kind of natural selection where there's more copies made than people will buy, and that people buy the ones that whatever that somehow are more interesting or whatever. But they don't. But whatever they did buy, we say that was more interesting, right? Like after the fact, right? Like again, if you have more grandkids, you are more evolved, you're more fit. You can't look at something and say it's more fit except for that it had more grandkids. Having more grandkids is the one and only meaning of being fit, period, end of story, ever. And again, wiggling that is where a lot of the confusion, people don't know they're confused, but the confusion of evolution comes in. The only thing that makes you more fit is having more grandkids, meaning you can only tell after the fact. You might be able to guess before the fact, right? Like for example, if I hold up a person and a bacteria, who do you think is going to have more grandkids? Well, probably bacteria, right? So bacteria are more fit than humans, if you're just simply consistent with just basic, obvious evolutionary theory. And that's the only possible meaning of fitness or natural selection or anything. There's nothing else but having more grandkids. And that's the fundamental confusion. Okay. I'll go to the questions in a few minutes, so if you have any. All right. I'm trying to see what we still need, like, if we can just understand natural selection. So when Darwin was around, there was no idea of DNA, there was no understanding of DNA. So he was just looking at like what we might call gross morphological differences. And then it became easy to imagine that nature is just throwing out these major gross morphological differences like it's nothing, like it's easy. Once we understood DNA, then DNA codes for, among other things, but mostly amino acids of proteins. Most of the body is constructed, of any organism is constructed via proteins as little molecular machines. And then there's some other parts of DNA that code for like stop or some other things, but mostly it's proteins. So proteins are pretty specialized machines, right? And one thing that might just be helpful on background to understand is that when you have things like proteins or machines, there's a lot more ways to break it than to improve it. And really, you almost can't improve it. But maybe you a little bit can. If you smash a plane with a hammer, then you might knock something off that's like cosmetic or for whatever reason is not necessary in the situation you need it for. Right? Even if you have like a jet and you knock off some of its missiles, then maybe it's a little bit more aerodynamic, and maybe that helps. All right. And to understand the difference between microevolution and macroevolution, you can just picture hitting a plane with a hammer, and you can microevolve it to improve it for various things, right? By smashing something off. But what you're not going to do by smashing it is turn it into a car. Now, what I'm saying doesn't prove anything. I'm not trying to make a case. I'm trying to just help you have tools to understand what's going on, right? So at least you have this distinction, and then you can see if it applies to what's going on. All right, I'm just giving you a distinction here. I'm not trying to make a case or prove something with this. Okay, so and again, an evolutionist can always just say stuff, but what about, and then fill in the blank, right? The more basic meta tools you have to give you basic clarity, the more you can kind of sort through those. But at least it's a distinction to see that you can improve a plane, a fighter plane, let's say, by smashing it in a sledgehammer. Mostly you will not make a difference, right? If you make a dent, let's say, it might look a little worse, but it's fine. And a lot of changes in DNA just don't really matter that much, right? And so just like hitting a fighter plane with a sledgehammer, most of the things you hit won't matter that much. Some things you hit might actually improve it for certain tasks, such as if you knock off some of its missile launchers or whatever it might have. And then it might be improved for carrying people, right? You could knock out seats and then it could have more people get jammed into it if it's doing an airlift out somewhere, right? So there's all sorts of ways you can improve a fighter jet by smashing it with a sledgehammer. But when someone says, well, why can't little changes add up to big changes? It's just a little bit easier to picture how that might not be the case. It doesn't prove that it is the case. You just, by having this mental picture and this distinction, you can see if it applies to a situation with evolution, and it constantly does. But I'm not trying to prove to you that it does. I just want to give you this distinction, right? So generally, what's happening with evolution is that sort of thing, where you're whacking a fighter jet with a sledgehammer. It improves in some cases. It's never going to turn into an automobile. It's never going to turn into a slug, like a slimy little slug, right, from a metal airplane, and so forth. And if someone does say that it could, they're just, that what they're doing is they're kind of moving their thinking and the discussion into a different realm of conjecture that we normally just use. Like, you don't really necessarily take them seriously at that point. Like, they could say, well, how do you know it won't turn into a slug if you hit it with a sledgehammer? And you could just kind of look at them like, if it matters in life to really know whether a plane, a fighter jet could really turn into a slug if you hit it with a sledgehammer a few times or several times or lots of times, if it really matters, then okay, but it probably just isn't going to matter, right? For about, I don't know how many years now, might even be like in the realm of like 40 or I think it's decades. I can get, there's an exact reference in a book that I can tell you about, Michael Behe's latest book. But there's these evolutionists, they've been doing this awesome thing where they've been breeding bacteria, and every night they take out like a sample of the bacteria. So they let it grow, they take out a little bit, which would be representative of the population, and then they regrow it, and every day, and that simulates basically evolution. And they've simulated now probably tens of millions of years of evolution. Guess how many rabbits have been made? You can just guess, right? Regardless of what you believe about evolution, in reality, if you had to bet your own money, how many rabbits? How many people? How many oak trees? Shockingly, they're still making bacteria. Now, those bacteria are reproducing faster, and if you look at the DNA, guess what? It's because of sledgehammer, right? You smash it, you have mutation, just like what you'd expect with a sledgehammer. Certain things have been broken that were kind of holding it back, in a sense, for that environment, for what they were eating, given to eat, and so forth, right? They no longer have a function that they can metabolize something like a type of sugar that's not in what they're given. So they're getting more specialized for their niche. And they're making more that this strain makes more grandkids better than the previous than what they started with. So there's been major microevolution, and guess what? They're all bacteria. They're not even a multicellular organism. But we knew that, didn't we? I mean, just intuitively. If you're an evolutionist, and if you're consistent with the theory of evolution, you should already take it for granted that eventually your kids' kids will be bacteria. But do you actually believe that? I'm betting you don't. Just intuitively, do you really think that your kids are going to multiply and they're going to keep going, and you're going to, because bacteria, like just on the simple face of it, they produce way more grandkids than you do. So they're more fit by evolution, right? And so evolutionists should believe not just that they came from bacteria, but that actually, well, they shouldn't believe, like, why do they believe they came from bacteria? They're less fit than bacteria just on the face of it, right? And certainly that less fit than cockroaches, right, and so forth. So you also wonder why everything didn't just turn into cockroaches and that's it. Everything's a cockroach, right? Okay. So no matter what I say, people can have objections. In other words, further confusions, right? I mean, eventually I could maybe iron them all out. That'd be great. I've read dozens of books on both sides and on various sides of the debate. And so what it comes down to for evolutionists as they condescend and often even correctly kind of refute some arguments that creationists or intelligent design theorists make. But what they definitely come down to this idea. It's always an idea of they can imagine small changes that are advantageous. And then they kind of blur things, and then that just adds up in their mind. But now I'm going to have to repeat myself of something I've kind of alluded to in the past, or even recently, I think on my series about God. But what we need to understand is to be able to picture that in order for a change to happen, like a primate to develop the ability to speak, right? We look back on that and say, oh yeah, you're more fit if you can speak. And you can come up with all sorts of ways why that can help you theoretically survive. But again, you're not trying to just survive, you're trying to have more grandkids specifically, right? But so they'll point out how something helps survival. And let me just put a little parenthetical here. One of the really weird things to me about arguments evolutionists make is that, not even arguments, but just the stories they tell, is they're constantly acting surprised, in essence, or like it's a thing, that something has a trait that enables it to survive, as if that shows that it had to have evolved. As if a creator, my point is it has nothing to do with evolution or creation. Because if you create something, like if you're a creator of life, of living organisms, don't you think that maybe you would create living organisms that had traits that enabled them to survive, right? It's like, okay. So like if you make a human and that human has things that enable it to survive, like the heart beats and it can eat food and metabolize it and so forth, then that shouldn't be like very surprising, right? That a creator would also make things that could survive and therefore have traits that enable them to survive. So they don't have to be called evolutionary traits. Michael Behe also points out something poignant, which is that whenever there's all these little statements that are peppered in through biologic tech, they're all over the place in culture, including if you get a course on like relationships, then they'll be like, well, men evolved to do such and such, and women evolved to do such and such. And what Michael Behe pointed out, who's just an author about on creationism or intelligent design, who's good, but he said if you just remove the statement evolved from the sentence, it doesn't change the meaning whatsoever, right? Like women have the following trait is exactly identical to women evolved to have the following trait, right? Like it doesn't add any new information. It doesn't allow you to predict anything or understand anything better or whatever, right? And it doesn't help you to understand that evolution occurred rather than some form of intervention, like creationistic intervention, because it could just as easily have been that a creator would give women or any organism certain traits that might help it survive or be suited to its environment. So it's kind of weird, once again, when you look at that, it's just a weirdness. It's like, why do you put in these statements about evolution that add no content to what you're saying? It's like this weird cult-like mantra that serves nothing except for to like just chant about the cult, that you're a member of the cult or that the cult should believe a certain thing. You just wouldn't expect that sort of behavior from normal people or normal thinkers, just to kind of put something in. Okay. So to me, the most poignant thing to picture about evolution, again, I'll go to the chat box once I describe this, is to just get very clear about what has to actually go on. So if you, I was saying like with ability to speak for primates, right? The evolutionists would say that at some point there were primates that could not speak, and then there were primates that could speak. Just like at some point there were no primates, and then at some point there were primates, right? Primates being like humans and monkeys and such. So therefore, it evolved, right? And so it was chance and necessity that did it, right? It was nature threw up variation, and natural selection selected for it gradually. Now, the reason they say gradually, and there's a good reason, is that if there's again, if you take the natural selection out of it, then you're just saying that one day there was a person who was born to parents who had no parts of the speech apparatus, and then one day they give birth to a child that had probably millions or more DNA mutations all at once that were just exactly what needed to happen for the physical speech and then for the neurological component of speech as well, right? You need to have the brain be able to interact with physical components to be able to speak. That is not something that evolutionists claim, and that the whole point of their theory is not to have to claim that, right? And which means that you need the natural selection part of the theory, not just the chance part of the theory. And keep in mind, if someone did have a mutation like that, it'd be a kind of a weird thing when it came to breeding, at the point where there's sexual reproduction. Keep in mind that for evolutionary theory to have really any fundamental relevance, it has to start from the very beginning and make life from non-life, right? Because there's really no point for anyone to an evolutionary theory where God made single-celled or multi-celled organisms through miraculous intervention, and then there was natural selection and evolution after that, right? You just kind of have no important theory. There's no cultural phenomenon to it anymore. That would totally validate the theistic view of life, and it would kind of. I don't want to psychoanalyze too much what the heck is going on in evolutionist mind, but there's I guess, again, I get it. When you look at it from the point of view of like, hey, I don't want to solve a murder by saying a ghost did it. And that's what it feels like to an evolutionist. I get it. That makes sense, right? You want to say like, no, this is a natural phenomenon. It makes sense. I can make sense out of it. I can see how this all happened, right? But in this case, it isn't. It turns out that the ghost did do it, so to speak. Because the theory, like, what about a third theory, right? Could there be something else? But you have to come up with it. But as far as I can tell, there can't really be a theory other than this sort of chance and necessity, natural selection and mutation model, or some basically choreographing on the part of God, right? Like deliberate intervention, creating things, at least organisms at the level of like a family, like in terms of classification of living things like kingdom, order, phylum, and so forth. Something around family, the genuses and species, as far as I understand, and this is now getting into science, not philosophy, but scientifically, it just looks like maybe some genuses, and then all the families would have had to been specifically created, and then you can have a microevolution where you're like hitting a fighter jet with a hammer to make differences after that. Like all the cichlids in Lake Victoria or whatever, there's a bunch of variation, and that looks like it could have come about through just messing around, breaking things that existing variety that was already there into different subspecies. But once again, they're shockingly all cichlids, right? There's no elephants that came from that, and and so forth. No bacteria. Again, what evolution should predict is that everything's evolving towards something like either a cockroach or just bacteria, right? That's the actual prediction, but they don't make that prediction, which is weird, right? And what actually happens, they don't predict anything, except for microevolution predicts things that are, again, useful and helpful. You could even use an evolutionary process with some phenomena, apparently like with designing a better plane wing. You can try to make an algorithm where you're just making a bunch of variety, right? It's like trial and error. Sometimes trial and error is the most efficient way to solve certain issues in some cases, right? You throw up random variation and then you're looking for something. You're looking for an improvement in some area. Of course, in that case, you have people designing that whole thing and they're creating it. So I keep trying to wrap up a thread here where in order to get this speech center, and this applies to everything, but just to give an example from a primate, what you need to do is have some mutation, so some DNA change, either one nucleotide of DNA, one letter of DNA, or a few letters or whatever. But whatever it is, it has to happen. And the critical thing to realize is it has to take over that gene pool. And this is, in essence, the kind of most poignant, clear part of understanding how ridiculous evolution is. If you go to your calculator and you start multiplying, like let's say I multiply 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8, now we're down to 0.4, right? If I do it a few more times, now we're down to 0.26. You get the point, but if I do it a few more times, oh boy, look where we are. We're going to get beneath 0.1, and then if we do it a million times, we're going to get to an extraordinarily small number, right? Now, if I multiply 1 times 1, then I'm not going to keep doing that. Whoops, sorry. You get the idea, right? 1 times 1 just stays at 1. So you need to take over all or nearly all of the gene pool. Now, why am I saying that? You might already see, but it's hard to see while you're listening to me too. So it's hard to like think for a while on your own at the same, like instantly while you're hearing me talk. So if I walk you through it, and this is basically measurable. We could see, okay, this many DNA changes roughly need to happen in order to get the speech apparatus in a primate between the physical stuff and the neurological stuff, right? And let's say it's 1 million, and I might be off by a factor of 10 or 100, but the point is the same. So let's say that's 1 million changes, and even if the changes happen in a couple letters at once or 2 or 3 letters at once, whatever, still like on the order of 1 million. So if we say it's 1 million, then what has to happen 1 million times is that a primate needs to be born with this mutation, and that mutation, and remember they're having sexual reproduction, so it's kind of an odd thing, right? It needs to be really significant if you think about it, because it needs to get through a gene pool where you have sexual reproduction. So it has to be so strong that you really wipe out everything else. If you don't wipe it out, let's say it's like advantageous, it's a little advantage, right? And again, it's only a little advantage if you actually have more grandkids. There's no such thing as, oh, that's convenient, or it helps you eat better, or it helps you hunt better, or it helps you avoid predators. That might be an after the fact explanation, but the only such thing as natural selection is if you actually have more grandkids in actual reality, right? That's all that natural selection means and nothing else. It does not mean that you're faster or smarter or have a new ability or anything, only that you have more grandkids, which often means you have less abilities, by the way. Once again, right? Again, keep in mind, bacteria and cockroaches are way more fit than you are. If we define fit exactly as having more grandkids, as far as I know, as far as I understand, earthworms. Okay, so regardless of that, regardless of the earthworm thing and cockroaches, whatever this change is, has to be a massive difference in them having grandkids, or at least has to make them so homicidal and successfully homicidal that they kill all the, everyone that doesn't have this gene, right? And this is one change in the DNA. This means that one protein in their whole body is shaped a little bit differently. That's what a mutation is. It ends up being a little bit different shape of one protein in the whole body. that has to take over the whole gene pool because it so massively makes you better at having grandkids for some reason, relative to the rest of the population, which might mean you kill them, right? But whatever it is, way better at having grandkids. And so, because even if you have hundreds of millions of years, well, that gets us to our other point, which I'll go to questions first. But then that needs to happen a million times, where there is a change that so differently affects your ability to have grandkids versus the rest of the population that you wipe out the whole population. Now, someone could say, well, David, couldn't they isolate? Couldn't this kid be born and wander off somewhere onto an island and all by himself reproduce? Well, of course, you'd need to have a wife or a mate. So how that's going to happen if it's sexual, if it's at the point where you have sexual reproduction, right? Which means that sexual reproduction is actually just a bizarrely unhelpful thing for this process. But again, no one's trying to make this process happen. It all just happens after the fact, right? What I mean is it's all about just whatever ends up having grandkids. No one's trying to have more grandkids. Keep that in mind. They're just having it. And so if you believe in evolution, you believe that happened a million times, where there was such an advantageous change to one protein, not the whole protein, but one amino acid in a protein, basically. And you can always just make a bigger leap if you want to say, well, actually, what if there were two changes simultaneous? Great. So two changes, some amount of changes. But if we too much take the small changes out, then we end up with kind of removing natural selection. Once again, we're just like saying, boom, it all happened by chance. They just, one day a kid was born with a million different DNA changes, and all of which just, made a whole speech center that, that worked. That'll be a bit like saying one day we had a copying error to Harry Potter, where there was a whole new chapter that was coherent and excellent, and added a whole new thing from a copying error. If there was an entirely written chapter that was well written and great and a big difference in the book, that where people want, remember, the only thing that would make it a much better chapter, even if the whole chapter was there, would be if people all bought that one, right? That's all that means to be more fit, is that more people buy your book or you have more grandkids, right? That's it. Not that you read it and it feels better or that you think it's better, but only that more people buy it. Or again, and of course, if there was a whole new chapter written that was coherent and good and people loved it, we would instantly assume that a person wrote that, not that it came from a copying error. And for good reason, right? Okay, so anyway, the theory says that. I'm just describing the theory. The theory says a million times you had a kid, that kid's with a mutation, that went and took over the whole gene pool, and that happened. And because if it didn't take over the whole gene pool, the problem is the next mutation would have to happen in a small part of the population, right? And it'll get swamped out. You need to take over the whole pool, or else you're doing what I did, where you're multiplying like 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8. I'm not saying whether this is likely or unlikely. Notice I'm just pointing out what an evolutionist actually has to believe if they just simply think it through, right? Just like a person who believes in taxation has to believe in me going to jail, or and they do, right? If I don't pay tax, if I quote unquote cheat on my taxes, they often affirm, oh no, I don't want you to go to jail, or oh no, or sometimes they say, oh yeah, I want you to go to jail, but other times, but that's all that can happen, right? If you have communism, all that can happen to have people be equal is to have people use violence and force to kind of cut people off the knees, basically, right, and take their property in order to redistribute it and make it equal, or just not allow people to own any property in the first place or something. But it has to happen through violence in order to ensure it, right? So if there's all these things in life, if you believe in one thing, you must believe in something that's logically a consequence of it. So this is what evolutionists must believe, that this actually did happen. And then you have this weird phenomenon where you actually do have primates that don't speak. So there's a million types of primates that are better with grandkids, more fit, right? Produce more grandkids. There's a million of those varieties in order that have all existed, taken over a gene pool, and yet you still have primates that don't have that, and there's a weird just lack of existence of all of these. Now, and what I'm saying, there wouldn't be many transitional forms because you'd wipe out the entire previous population, right? That's another reason why they had to wipe it out, is otherwise you just have all these intermediate things existing, right? Remember, there's a million just between a primate not being able to speak and being able to speak. That's a ton of stuff. That's not like one whale with some foot bones or something, right? That's a million, not generations. If it's happened generation after generation, that would be, it's no way, right? It has to take over a whole gene pool takes many generations, right? Unless the guy just was born and just killed everyone else and had sex like a maniac, right? Or whatever. But this has to be so advantageous that mathematically it ends up swamping out the rest of the gene pool, right? Kind of like naturally, right? And of course, the idea that each of these mutations made somebody so homicidal, right? It just wouldn't make any sense. Right. So it couldn't be through like just killing all of their fellow species mates, right? Because if they were that homicidal, how would the next mutation be even more homicidal, where they'd have to at least be so much better at killing, right? With one more protein difference, that they successfully killed all their, the other guys that successfully killed the ones before that, and so forth. So you need many, many, many generations just to have each mutation take over the gene pool. And then that had to happen over and over and over and over and over again without any of those still being alive. But I just said they shouldn't be alive. They had to wipe everyone out, right? But then you have this weird phenomenon where we have all this diversity in life. And the fossil record has fossils of existing organisms or existing known organisms just keep showing up in the fossil record. And they'll find stuff that, there's also organisms that have been relatively unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. You can look at their DNA, and there's all sorts of things that just go straight along with what you would think if evolution wasn't going on in this way, right? And everything we see always at all times is in accordance with this not being the case, this not happening. And again, even just your simple intuitions about life, where you don't really think that if you keep having kids and your kids have kids and so forth, that's going to be a cockroach or bacteria. Whereas you should, right? Because they're just so much better having grandkids. If evolution could predict anything, it would predict that. If it can't predict something like that, then what does it predict at all? Like, it just doesn't do anything. The only thing it can do is like try to rip the purpose out of nature. Again, it just make us feel like we, that sense that, oh, God doesn't interfere, or whatever. Okay, I better go to questions, even though of course I can always talk and talk and talk. There's something else I kind of want to talk about with a purpose, but let's take a look here. Just to pick randomly, here. So Mahai, just to understand a specific thing. Let's say I had godlike abilities and I were to pick which offspring would reproduce onwards, and I had hundreds of million years at my disposal. Would I be able to turn a fish into a mammal? Oh, okay. If you could intentionally mutate, your DNA, if you could genetically engineer, we could do this, and you could kind of picture this, right? You take a human DNA, and in test tube you modify it. The main thing you would need to do is figure out a whole bunch of modifications all at once to do, right? Because the idea that there's actually intermediate steps that would even survive at all, not even to take over the gene pool, but just to even live, like for a second, between a fish and a human, or a fish and a land mammal or whatever, isn't just scientifically. If people weren't so weirdly biased or religious about evolution, it's just obviously not the case. Right? So in order to turn a fish into like a land mammal that's somewhat similar to a fish, you would need to make a lot of changes at once. I'm very confident saying it's kind of like if you imagine a theoretical space of DNA spaces, DNA probability spaces, and like here's a DNA where you have a viable organism, and here's a DNA with a viable organism, and in between you have these islands, right? And in between those, there's all these combinations of DNA that do not produce viable organisms. Not even fit, just they wouldn't live, right? And so crossing from one island to another, you need to kind of hop from one island to another. And it's not that I'm trying to convince you of this. I'm just, if at the point where people can just think reasonably about this, like they do in other areas of life when they do think reasonably, then this is just sort of dead obvious. This isn't like trying to convince an evolutionist of something to do with evolution. Again, their mind just keeps on leaping all over the place. And in some cases you can, if someone's kind of close or wondering or willing to kind of somehow stick to one thought and think it through. But yeah, I don't think if you had godlike abilities, I think what you would do with those godlike abilities is figure out basically the DNA, mostly from scratch, to make the land mammal. But you could certainly use a lot of what you'd already created. One thing that people don't really kind of realize, and I didn't even mention this in the God's Existence in Nature talk, I could have said much more. Even after I did my 4th webinar with that, I was like, oh, I didn't mention this or that or this. There's always more. And there's always a better way I could have said something, and there's always threads I realized I started in the webinar and then I never finished the thread. I'm sorry. I talk a little bit like Rush Limbaugh did. Obviously he's passed away now, unfortunately, but he would have like notes and then he would just kind of talk off the top of his head. And he'd said at one point, like, he couldn't even try to, like, if he had like a speech like at CPAC or something, he couldn't even, just the way his personality and brain worked, he couldn't like write it ahead of time. He just had to have a sense of what he would talk about and just talk. And that's how it is kind of for me. There's only like a certain amount of organization that I'm able to, put in these things. But yeah, and what I was saying is that all of existence is sort of like, in a certain somewhat metaphorical way that's not a perfect metaphor, is God's mind. Not God's consciousness screen, but like all the reasons and bits of knowledge and everything. Like God's aware of everything. So of course, and God, so God would draw on, like when we think of fish exist, let's say there was like just fish in the sea and stuff like that, and whatever else. At some point, I forget that. I do affirm faunal progression, faunal succession, which that term means, I do think that after whatever, what was it? After maybe 500 million years or so, like the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. After about 500 million years, I think you had the first single-celled organisms, perhaps. And you go that far back, maybe there's some issue with the dating or something, but roughly like that. And then after about 2 billion more years, I think it was, and you get multi-celled organisms, and then there was a progression of flora and fauna that appeared. I do think that did happen. I mean, because again, when you just using standard science and historical science, then that thing just match up with that extremely well. But yeah, if you had a fish, then you could draw on certain things you learned from the fish or had stored or worked in the fish, but then you would have to design a lot of stuff additionally, and then you change some stuff and remove some things and so forth in order to make a land mammal. And that's basically what would have had to have happened in actual reality, which is, again, it's hard to feel and picture that, but harder. It reminds me of being an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur even now just seems like incredibly daunting and impossible. But to me, getting a job just seemed way worse. And so that was my motivation or my thing. Like the thing with evolution is just not at all. It just doesn't work. It's exactly against logic in every way. And I've scratched the tiniest bit of surface, but I'm trying to get to the core ideas and things that you can picture. Lauren says, I say this in the most loving way possible, but this is making an unusual amount of sense. I'm used to coming out with more questions than answers on these topics. Good, I'm making sense. I'm glad to hear that, because so I often talk and I have no idea how much. I mean, there's sense in my head, but I don't know how well I communicate very often. But that's good to hear. Good, I'm glad. Again, I really think if you just see that, like about the natural selection and that sort of thing, and just seeing what would have to happen to make any change, it's not. Let me talk about the God of the gaps issue, where it's not that I'm looking at something complex, like the ability that humans have to speak, and saying, whoa, that's amazing, that's so complex. How could you get something that complex through chance, right? That's kind of the caricatured argument. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's just see what actually would have to happen. I'm not even saying it did or didn't happen. I mean, I am saying it didn't happen, but I don't need to say that, right? If we just walk through it, it just clearly gets to be absurd on its face just to see what actually would have happened. When evolutionists tell the story, and you can spot this now, they never just go through what I went through. What they do is they switch the meaning of natural selection to mean like nifty stuff, right? And then they kind of zoom out and it's kind of blurry, kind of big picture, 40,000 feet view and so forth. And it's like, yeah, I can absolutely imagine like having a change where a person can make like a little bit of sound, but they can't really process speech, but that can help them warn people. And then I can imagine, right? So they kind of, I can imagine this, I can imagine that. And it's like these little changes that they can, and they make these little stories, right? And it just sounds, if you're zoomed out and blurry, it sounds, I mean, to me, it's so ridiculous at this point that it's hard to even say it sounds right, but I kind of get how it can sound like it makes sense. I mean, boy, I've read some of the press releases they accidentally released. There's like 2 of them in Russia, like, because they'll often print things just in advance of a news event that they figure would happen. And they make this kind of coherent sense about the invasion that if you just ignore some massive obvious truths and facts, it all just kind of fits in the minds of many Russians. And these are actual Russians. I'm not like prejudiced against Russian people. It's quite the opposite. But at this point, I've just seen in the minds of so many of them, and it's this coherent story of like great news. This is like it was released a couple days after the invasion, and when they thought that they might win in a few days. And so they had this written up and they released it for a little while and took it back. But even if it was fake, which I don't think it was, I think it was a real thing that was meant that they meant to print if the invasion worked quickly. But even if it's fake, it's still poignant, and the story it weaves is a real story. It's like, it's great news. We have a courageous, wonderful leader who refused to pass off the Ukrainian question onto next generations and wanted to solve it. Now we're back united, Russians, Belarusians, and little Russians, how they talk about Ukrainians, but it's not really a derogatory term, it's more like an affectionate term. We're all together now, and we're one country again, and things like that, right? And they had this idea, there's Nazis there, we need to get rid of them, and and all that, right? So, and it was just this sense of just, wow, that's nice, our family's together, and we didn't push the problem of Ukraine being free and independent, so to speak, right, relatively, to another generation. But you don't say free and independent, you just say, the Ukrainian question. I didn't put it off, and now, the bad guys, the anti-Russians that want to invade Russia, and they're Nazis and nationalists, and thank goodness they're gone, and now we're all together again, right? And more of that, like, and you read it and you're like, wow, like you could see how someone that's the only thing they hear, it makes a certain type of sense. Okay, so what if the environment micro changes such that it facilitates micro advantages? You're just gonna still need to come back to you can pick literally everything in life, but in terms of diversity of organisms, but like a tree sloth, right? The next, its kin has totally different behaviors. The tree sloth like does this whole shebang, and then it climbs down and poops on the ground, and because it can't like poop in the tree where it mainly lives, and buries its stuff, and it has all these changes, and it's not like it's adapted to the environment. It's just like diversity. I don't know, this is a very good answer, but yes, but what if the environment micro changes such that it facilitates micro advantages? Like, how would that play out with the thing we're talking about, speech? Like, you can just flat out count up roughly how many pieces of DNA are involved in being able to speak. Both, again, you have the physical and the neurological, and what kind of micro changes in the micro environment would change this overall truth about what would have to happen. Oh, did the audio get choppy, or is it back? It's okay. Okay, good. Good. I didn't get a message that we were bad. Sorry if I'm not giving a full answer. If you elaborate a bit, I might try. Let me see what else you said. Just to, let me read what sorry, you say. Just to understand a specific thing. Oh yeah, okay, I did address that. Standardized text, so-called experts, it takes getting underneath. Yeah, and one thing I keep thinking about that when I think about evolution and the disillusionment with it, but then I think about the stuff against vaccines, and I think, well, where does it go wrong? Like, I'm not emotional either way about the vaccine thing, but it can't just be, or I read something that there was a comment somehow on thehill.com, which is kind of a reasonable, place. They talk about politics and they have some different viewpoints that are pretty good. And one of them's a libertarian, that writes for editor for Reason magazine. And then there's a girl who's pretty cool in the middle-ish or whatever. But anyway, and they tend to like, freedom and people not getting killed and so forth. But when between both the people listening to them and them, when they talk about the Russia situation, and then there was a comment where it's like, oh, what can you believe in the news these days, or something like that. Well, there's that, yeah, but you need to realize the other end of it is that there's a whole lot of true stuff in the news, and like if the news says that like Paris got blown up tomorrow, it's big news everywhere, then yeah, I don't like believe what the New York Times writes, but that's probably true if they're all reporting it. You know what I'm saying? Like, we need a conclusion other than that, oh, we just can't trust the experts, or again, we can say, oh, we have to think. What a lot of people say is we have to think for ourselves, but you know what I think about that is it doesn't help to think for yourself unless you figure out how to think for yourself, right? So the good conclusion is, same thing about like, what if I was raised in Nazi Germany, or what if I was an Israelite in Jerusalem when they were calling for Jesus to be killed, would I be calling for him to be crucified? What is the default thinking? How do we get underneath it? And it can't just be a compilation of, kind of like, I would say, ad hoc things, meaning like people in our society kind of memorize that rape is bad, right? But they don't have a concept of visual property rights, so it's not really a basis for why rape is bad. It is, right? But it's just sort of memorized, right? Like, that's what I mean by ad hoc, like to this, like it means just kind of a band-aid, here and there. Like I have a family member who voted for Bill Clinton, and then they said they regretted it later, and that, but they didn't like fundamentally look to change their understanding of things, right? Like people think, oh, I know not to be a Nazi, but if you don't change your underlying thinking, right? Like Russians hate Nazis because the Nazis invaded Russia, and it was like the most recent big thing. It's like their number one thing they hate are like Nazis, because of the invasion, right? And Russia, and it was the siege of Leningrad, and which I think is St. Petersburg now, but they're like identical, roughly speaking, in terms of the overall. Obviously, individual Russians vary. There's my wife's always been anti-Putin ever since he was elected in '99 or 2000 or something, and of course is pro-Ukraine and very much couldn't be more against the war. And there's lots of Russians like that, but there's a ton that aren't, right? So it doesn't help to just or oh, I won't believe what's in the New York Times or the mainstream media, but there has to be something a lot deeper than that, where it goes to a much deeper method. Fletch says, leaving aside how evolution is conceived in mainstream, one concept of being created in God's image, whether that is true or what it might mean. And if God created the universe, which you've discussed, it could follow that the image humans or even creation was created to do was create and share, which matter and energy apparently does. Seems a way I could conceive of what all this has been created to be about. Well, okay, let me talk about purpose here. So with evolutionary theory, the grand scale theory, the idea is to, or not the idea, the effect is to, there's no purpose in nature. Now, this leads to an absurdity. And then the way a lot of people deal with absurdities is they just decide the conclusion is absurd. But it leads to a correct conclusion that's absurd, which means there's a problem with the premise, not the conclusion. So In the grand scale, macroevolution, evolutionary theory, that's, culturally extremely prevalent and popular, then nothing is done for a purpose, just like a rock does not fall on purpose because of gravity. It just falls, we say, because of gravity, but it doesn't try to fall, right? So similarly, organisms live and give birth and evolve, and nothing is trying to do anything. Nothing does something for a reason or a purpose. After the fact, it looks like the reason was to have more grandkids, but nothing did things, and nothing's striving, trying to have more grandkids. Again, it's just after the fact, it looks like that. It's just a logical phenomenon, just like I use that cool example of the even numbers. You add up even numbers, you're never going to get an odd number. That's not because there's a law of nature or a force making it happen. It's just a consequence of the parameters. So humans, according to the theory, evolved and are part of nature. And that's you and me, according to the theory. And so nowhere then did purpose enter. So that means nothing you do is for a purpose. In other words, if you go to the bank and you think you're going to the bank in order to withdraw money, that can't be the case. The reason you're going to the bank is because one day there was a bunch of humans that didn't go to the bank, and then there was a mutation where you did go to the bank, and that took over the gene pool. That's basically what evolution is saying. Again, it's hard because evolution is so absurd. That's the weird thing about evolution, is it's not like it's wrong. It's just so bizarrely stupid and absurd and crazy. There's almost no word for it, right? Because it says explicitly and implicitly, there's no purpose in nature, and we're part of nature. We have not that we have no greater purpose. We literally have no micro purposes. There can't be any purpose. There is no purpose. So you can't do anything on purpose. You didn't make a business to make money. You didn't get up in order to be out of bed. You don't eat in order to survive. Like nothing, there's no purpose. That's what no purpose means. And again, it's hard to wrap your head around it because it's so nonsense. It's so antithetical to every second of every day, everything that we, take for granted, much like property rights. But don't we see that? It's so nonsense to try to think in terms of there being no property rights whatsoever. And yet people don't believe in property rights, right, when it comes to government. The law, right? And people, one of the things that people have such a hard time keeping consistent is the implicit all, A-L-L. And a great way for me to illustrate this is with law. And I have mentioned this in the past at some point. But if someone believes in the law, including they say the law is necessary, which means the law is good, right? I talked about that before too. If something's necessary, it must mean it's good on balance, right? Net. Then you must believe in all laws all the time, everywhere, even on another planet or your universe or whatever. Because you didn't qualify yourself. You just said, I believe in the law. If you don't qualify yourself, it means all. It must mean all. You can say, someone can say, well, you know what I mean. No, I don't know what you mean. What the heck could you mean? If it's not all laws all the time, anywhere, always, then what is it? American laws? When? Always? Every American law? All the time? Everywhere, including slavery, of course, and lots of other things, laws against practicing gay sex, right, and so forth. Are all of those good and necessary and you believe in them all? What if a future law is made that, how about women couldn't vote? I'm not really commenting on whether it's, for me, voting is, it's like mob rule. It's like whether women can join the mob or not is not really matters ultimately. But like being able to join something bad is what I'm saying is not really relevant. I'm not saying voting is bad, but the whole mob rule isn't great. So what law, right? Like all. So literally, if someone believes in law, then they're making a huge mistake. Now, Trump talks about this. I like Trump as president relative to other presidents. Of course, he makes, like all of them, like huge, massive, evil mistakes, right? But then in the real world, yeah, terrific president given alternatives. So this implicit all is critical. So if there's no purpose, there's no purpose, always, all the time, in every case. if there is purpose to anything you do ever, then it means that purpose came in somewhere into nature, because you're part of nature according to this theory, you see? So either there's no purpose, never, ever, ever, in any case, period, end of story, or it magically came in somewhere antithetical to the theory, against the theory. So nothing you do is with any purpose whatsoever, despite the fact that what you think according to the theory. Again, that is an absolute absurdity, but what people will do is, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous, and they'll change the subject. But when you have something that absurd, it shows that there's a problem with the premise. Actually, everything started with purpose inherently, right? That's why, I talked about you start with consciousness. With evolutionary theory, consciousness doesn't exist anywhere, so it just kind of gets magically put in and taken and then like kind of ignored, right? It's like, oh, sure, we're conscious, all right, yeah. Like, or they'll talk about, it's a problem of consciousness. It's a great mystery of consciousness, right? Of course, it's a mystery if you start with a premise that excludes it. And then where's it come from? But the mystery is solved by realizing the premise is wrong. You can't solve a mystery, right? Once you define the meaning of 8 and 3 and plus and equals, it's not a mystery of how it equals 12. It's not a mystery. It's just wrong. It just isn't the case. Or if you misdefine 3 to be 4, and then whatever, you can work through it yourself. So if you start with an absurd premise, you come to an absurd conclusion. It's not a mystery of how the conclusion can be correct. The way to solve it all is to realize the assumption is wrong. So it all started with purpose, and it started with consciousness and consciousness field screens. And that's, as I described in the previous, right? So that's a separate issue. We know that God creates everything at every moment anyway. The practical question, or to whatever degree it's practical with evolution, separate from the main thing is the theory of mind idea of how is this a cultural phenomenon. But then the other issue is just, well, what did God choreograph to the extent that that might matter, right? Like what did God directly intervene and do? And then just as a pure scientific conclusion, state dependence, before I forget. So I gave a quick spiel on purpose there. But keep that in mind, it's fascinating. Because where did purpose come in? And if an evolutionist wants to be clever, oh, there is no purpose. Ha ha ha. Well, great. That means literally nothing they do is with purpose. Which they can't uphold for a second, actually thinking that way. And that's why their language keeps coming back. Nature did this, nature did that, and so forth. All right, state dependence. Now, state dependence, what I'm going to explain here quickly, or hopefully quickly, will get rid of there's an idea that, okay, given infinite time, any combination of things will be realized. That's what people think when they're thinking incorrectly, or when they're ignoring state dependence. So here's how things actually work logically. If you keep mixing things around for long enough, then given what you started with, so you have to start with something, and the method of mixing, right? So you start with a bunch of stuff, but you start with all that, and then if you keep mixing, then yeah, you'll get every combination. However, but what that means is, as soon as you get a combination, what happens next moment? You get a completely arbitrary random configuration next moment that has nothing to do with the previous moment. Or, the only alternative is state dependence. And what state dependence means in my terminology here, and in existing terminology, but it can mean different things, but whatever, or in different subjects or areas of life. But in this case, it doesn't mean like you're dependent on the state for welfare. It means that the way that, of course, the world works, and certainly scientifically, this is assumed and operated on, is that the configuration of things right now is dependent on what? The configuration of things last instant, which was dependent on things, right? It's not exactly the same, but it's based on it. And then regularities or certain laws, right? Obvious. And we take this so for granted, we don't even think of it or have a term for it for most people, right? We just so used to it. But the minute you have state dependence, it now becomes critically and importantly false that given infinite time, you realize all possibilities. So you either have a case where once you realize the possibility of not infinite, whatever, of all the different possibilities, not actually infinite in any of these cases. If it's infinite, it's now nonsense, right? But there's a certain, whatever possible configuration there is, if you have a bunch of marbles and you're mixing them, or a bunch of pixels and whatever, it always has to be finite, right? Anything that actually exists has to be finite. So you have a finite number of combinations. You either have a situation, you either set things up so that you can realize all of the possible combinations eventually. Like you'll get every possible hand of cards if you keep dealing enough of them, right? If you set that situation up to allow for that, then the next hand dealt will have nothing to do with the previous hand. Or you set up a situation where you do not get all the possibilities because state dependence cuts off previous possibilities. Now you could try playing mental gymnastics and seeing. You could try to set up parameters. It's going to end up being one or the other, but you can create something that kind of looks like maybe it's a little one, a little the other. But my point is going to remain the same. The distinction is going to remain there regardless. If you want to preserve a certain combination, then you do that at the cost of mixing for future combinations. Basically, is how it works. So if you're driving randomly around the United States, this is where the driving out of San Francisco phrase came from that I use here, or that I wish I use it when I talk to Mike. I don't use it much publicly because I haven't explained it very well publicly. But the idea is if you drive randomly around the United States, then eventually a person will end up in San Francisco. However, if you don't identify San Francisco in advance and have like a stop function when you get there, what's going to happen? You're going to drive back out. So with anything in life, this applies to lots of things that come up in business, is if you don't realize what you're doing right when it comes to marketing or a product or whatever, you just kind of did it, but you didn't realize a distinction of what you got right. You might have a sense of what you got right, but there are distinctions, there's nuances you're not noticing. Then you'll drive out of San Francisco and stop doing them right because you didn't realize you were there. So you kind of randomly, through a bit of luck, arrived at correct answers or solutions or whatever. But then if you're not aware of them, they're not programmed in, right? You have to program in the stopping point into the system in order to have the system stop when you reach what you want. Like, the idea that if a monkey types long enough, he could get Hamlet. But what you can't do, there's two things you can't do that if you apply it to actual real life evolutionary theory. You can't start with nothing in a room, no monkey, no typewriter, no nothing, and have a monkey type Shakespeare, right? You have to start with a whole bunch of stuff, like a monkey, Shakespeare, a whole bunch of food, a whole bunch of ink, a whole bunch of paper, right? Someone to do something to make sure the monkey keeps typing, right? I mean, it's extremely lots of apparatus involved in having a monkey actually type Shakespeare, not nothing. And not like an explosion, like a big bang. But separately from that, to my point here about state dependence, is what you cannot do is have a monkey, if we just forget about all the complexities of actually having a monkey staying fed and keeping typing and having paper and so forth, if we just take the idea that's abstract. Yeah, so the monkey keeps typing, it'll eventually type out Hamlet. But what it won't do is then stop at Hamlet. It'll keep typing unless you literally program Hamlet in advance. And that's critical for evolution. And here's what'll happen. Suppose you are gambling at a casino and the odds are 100 to 1, even if they're 49, 51% against you, but if they're 100 to 1 against you, and you keep betting, will you end up with an infinite amount of money? Will you end up super rich? They're against you, 100 to 1 the odds. So you see, it's state dependent. So your amount of money is based on your previous amount of money plus the next bet. Do you see? So what's going to happen over time is you're going to go more and more negative. In 1 out of 100 times, you'll jump up positive, right? But what will happen is negative. And even if someone gets incredibly lucky, it's true in logically that what will happen is it'll march toward negative in reality. Like luck doesn't change the logic of the scenario where you'll end up more negative over time. It can change the actual outcome for as many times as you get lucky. But like in the real world, I'm having trouble kind of bridging this. I conceptually in my head, but I can't come up with the word. So just stick with this. I think you probably see my point. So this happens all over the place with evolution. Is the way that nature works in terms of physical laws, right? Is things like if you have protein in water, it's going to tend to break down into its component amino acids rather than be built up into a larger protein, right? That's basic chemistry and/or biochemistry. Okay, it's technically biochemistry because proteins are organic molecules, or at least it's organic chemistry. But it's basic chemistry is that when you're putting amino acid pieces together, you're breaking an H off of one end of an amino acid. It's like a children's toy with like a thing that you stick together, but you have to remove a little cap on this end and a little cap on this end, and they stick together. And then the H and the OH that you removed to make the two amino acids stick together become H2O, right? Water. So when you make a protein, you're sticking amino acids together like a children's toy. And on the side, you're getting water. So when a reaction like that makes water, and this is basic chemistry, it's not controversial whatsoever, I'm just making sure you guys know it. It's the tip of your tongue. So and if it's not the tip of the tongue of an evolutionist or someone talking about creating the first cells, then they're missing a massively important thing. If they don't know about racemates, they're missing an incredibly important thing, right? Every amino acid except for glycine has two different types of handedness, left-handed and right-handedness, and you can only use one of the two. I forget which, whether it's dextro rotatory or lever rotatory in life. And it's toxic to the other one. But in nature, you have both, even amount of both. The only place you have it filtered out is through life mechanisms. So if you're trying to make these organic soup of starting molecules, it's in water, in and out of the whatever the membrane is that you magically have all at once, to make it. And so you can't put amino acids together and release water in a situation where there's already lots of water. Reactions don't work that way. If you have lots of water, you want to have reactions that get rid of water, not that add even more water into the system. It's a similar process. It's logically similar to if you put your hand in a solution of pure water, the water will go into your hand because there's more pure water outside your hand than inside. There's more water basically outside your hand than but not total water. There's more concentrated water. So it's going to want to go to where there's less. It's the same principle as if you spill perfume in a corner of the room. It's going to spread throughout the room. The reason why that happens is because there's more ways. All of this is not a force. It's a logical consequence of the way things work. There's more ways to have perfume go around the room than there are for it to stay in the corner, basically. That's kind of a quick simplification. But each time things move, then it's like rolling a die where if you roll a 2 through 6 on a 6-sided die, there's more ways to roll a 2 through 6 than a 1. So it could look like there's a force making you unlikely to roll a 1, if you look at it that way, right? But there's not a force making you unlikely to roll a 1 on a 6-sided die. There's just more ways to roll a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 than there are to roll a 1. So you end up more often not rolling a 1 than rolling a 1. Same with perfume in the corner of a room. The smell will spread around because there's more ways for the perfume molecules to go in other places of the room rather than stay in the corner. Another word for that is entropy. It looks like nature wants to have entropy, to be more disorder, but it's not exactly disorder. It's actually that there's more ways, like there's more ways for a room to be messy than for it to be neat. It's not that the room wants to be messy, or my basement wants to be messy. There's just a lot more ways for it to be messy than for it to be neat. And so it's the same phenomenon as rolling the 6-sided die and not getting a 1. That's why only 1/6 of my basement is clean. Okay, this at least covers the various things. This is a super important idea because it comes up, right? And people thinking about evolution, especially lay people, any of them, but they'll, often, well, you'll get any combination given enough time. That's absolutely false, given state dependent. And the reason I brought up the protein molecules is that it's like betting at a casino to try to make a protein in a aqueous solution or a water solution, a solution that involves water. Then you're betting at a casino. You're trying to make money with the odds being 100 to 1 against you. So yeah, you can have 2 amino acids. If you have a bunch of amino acids in water, sometimes they may come together and 2 of them might stick together, right? Sometimes you might get 3, but basically they're gonna split apart. If you start with all amino acids separated, then you're gonna get a little bit more where they're sticking together than having 0, because once the same phenomenon of protein of a perfume in the corner of a room, it's gonna spread throughout the room. So you're gonna get these different outcomes, the different probability spaces are gonna fill in. But if you put proteins, or you try to make a long chain protein in water, it's not gonna happen. It's gonna break down. Even if you make it, you're gonna drive right out of San Francisco, because even if you make a profit when the odds are 100 to 1 against you, you're gonna keep betting and lose that profit. The same exact thing, proteins, same exact thing with nucleic acids, which form DNA and RNA. You don't get these long chains. They all break down. In a cell, you have a complex mechanism that makes it all work. And the problem is not that mechanism is improbable and that you eventually get it, right? Getting that is the same thing as saying that a scientific theory, evolution comes down to this. It's a scientific theory saying that if you're betting in a casino with odds 100 to 1 against you, and you're betting the same amount every time, right? It's not like the one time you win, you get a lot more money, right? So you're betting the same amount of time, the odds are 100 to 1 against you, having a scientific theory that you will make money as long as you bet long enough. That's why I call it stupid, because if a person applied that to Vegas, they would be broke, and way worse than broke. They'd be in debt and so forth, right? So again, evolution, to summarize things in a sort of pithy way, is the scientific theory that if you go to Vegas at 100 to 1 odds against you and bet the same amount of money, that as long as you just have enough time, you'll become ultra wealthy. It's not improbable. It isn't going to happen. And it's impossible for a whole bunch of other reasons, right? Like all of what I described, it's not about improbability, and it's not about gaps. It's not like saying, I started to mention the God of the gaps thing. It's not like, because what evolutionists will say is this, is like, look, here's what creationists say. Well, you can't get that through evolution. Well, you can't get that through evolution. I bet you can't figure out how to get that through evolution. And they say science marches on and we keep solving problems. And so they're on the wrong side of history, creationists are, because they're just like looking at us and nitpicking and criticizing and saying, you don't know how to solve that, you don't know how to solve that. And we keep solving more things. And so they're just arguing negatively and saying, you can't do that, you can't do that. And we keep doing it, right? We keep filling in blanks and and so forth. And that's what they say, is like, they're saying, oh, science can't explain this, therefore God did it. Science can't explain this, therefore. No, when we go, I explained what had to happen for that primate to evolve to have speech. I explained what it did have to happen. I didn't say, oh, look at speech, it's so complicated, isn't that amazing, God did it. I explained what did have to happen, and you can judge for yourself. When it comes to this Vegas example here, or illustration, I'm not saying science can't explain, well, why he's going to get rich, or we know exactly what's going to happen. It's a scientific answer. You set up parameter, or it's logical. It's logical and/or can be demonstrated scientifically, right? You set up parameters the way I did, 100 to 1 odds against you, bet the same amount each time. You are going to keep going more and more negative, of course, with blips on average every 100 times. Of course, not actually at 1 out of every 100 times. That's not the way probabilities work. But you're gonna, just keep, the more time that goes on, the more negative. And in any other area of life where where a person doesn't have this religious, weird brainwashing, or just this metaphor that's incorrect in their mind, or whatever it is, the story they want to believe. And when we take that out, people do the obvious, right? Like, the first thing Democrats did when they were scared that the few dozen unarmed protesters would return to the Capitol for the inauguration and defeat the entire U.S. military, reserves, what are they called? What are the state guys that they brought in? I'm just blanking out. And all the police and federal police and local police and everything. So they were worried that another few dozen people would come unarmed, that they'd have to shoot in the back and do it. So what do? They immediately built a fence and got police or National Guardsmen, they're called, to act as police, like 26,000 of them or something, right, to defend against another few dozen unarmed people coming again to insurrect. I'm not twisting history. This actually happened. So the first thing they did was build a fence and get police. So it's dead obvious to them what to do if they wanted to defend against people that they imagined invading the Capitol. My point here is that the minute something is taken outside of this bizarre religious dogma or metaphors they have in their mind that substitute for reality, they immediately figure out accurately, basically, right? Of course, it's inaccurate given what the threat was, but if there's some sort of armed threat in their mind, then they got police and a fence. And what have they been telling us ad nauseum for as long as we can think? That fences and walls don't work, and defund the police. Neither of which, by the way, I have complex views about border and immigration and about the police. So it's not like I'm on the Republican side of either of those issues exactly, but it's just funny that instantly when they're just in a normal situation that's not part of their religious dogma, they instantly come up with what's dead obvious, right? While they've been denying it explicitly. They literally, walls don't work, walls don't work, walls don't work, right? Defund the police, policing doesn't work. For other reasons, there might be issues with policing, but the minute they want to defend against armed people, what do they have? Oh, and they're anti-gun, and yet all those National Guardsmen have guns, right? So it's just, guns don't work. Guns aren't good for self-defense. Fences don't work. And then the same thing with evolution. Evolutionists can think just fine when there's not some kind of bizarre thing going on with their mind and dogma and these beliefs and and so forth. But then when these things are, and it's fascinating to study, and I don't even have it all figured out yet, but it's fascinating to try to figure out, well, so what are the ingredients that cause someone to just lose their mind, right? And you felt it, and Lauren said, you felt it, and I see it with Russians, and I see it myself in reading what the Russians are told. It kind of feels plausible if you just exclude major things, right? Then that kind of goes on. Mahai says, for example, the skin would be excellent for a specific temperature, because I asked him to clarify. Okay. And another skin type would regress. Oh, like if someone had darker or lighter skin. Oh yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, if the environment changes to favor, if there's already variety, or if there's variety that can be created by breaking a piece of protein or changing how it's shaped, right, by having a DNA. Like if there's absolutely. Like, as I say, there's an evolution that happens and that works, and I tried to describe it, and that's real and it works, right? Many species came from the type of evolution that actually happens. But it's akin to hitting a fighter jet with a hammer, or akin to breeding those bacteria generation after generation, as is explained. So Michael, you can look up Michael Behe and just look at his latest book, Behe. Is his last name, and his latest book is very interesting because it's new science. It's newly discovered. There's just newly the tools and the knowledge, is what I mean, to understand about exactly where the cutoff is in terms of classification levels when it comes to evolution. And it's roughly within what it's often classified. It's not exact because classifications are more morphological, like they're more gross. Gross morphology means like the shape of an organism, right? Like not the DNA, but the way the body looks. And sometimes bodies can look similar and have very different DNA. Sometimes things can have very different DNA and look similar. But anyhow, roughly at the level of family, like right above genus and species, is where there would have had to be direct intervention because there's just no real way. And again, we know the science is there. You can just look at the DNA. You can see like how many changes would have to be made, And remember, those changes need to be made by completely wiping out the entire population. That's the real key. Even though there's a lot of, there's all of these are pretty key, these kind of ideas: state dependence, purpose, understanding what chance does, and then but especially just realizing that you have to, for every mutation, you have to basically take over the entire population. And yet we keep being left with existing organisms, things that existed previously. That piece about memorizing something is bad versus understanding is exactly what I'm trying to work through with my kids. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, like looking at the what's underneath. You probably heard me say this, but from a young age, I taught my son basically 2 principles that also included our parenting of him, which was that we had to, within reason, keep him safe. That could be used as an excuse for anything if you use it too much, but I had to keep him safe from like really kind of being taken out in life, like getting run over by a car, burning himself terribly badly, things like that. Not like keeping him from every possibility of of something bad happening, but keeping him safe, and then property rights, individual property rights. And I've never taken anything away from him that he viewed as his property. And like when I gave him a laptop to use, I made it clear that was my laptop that I was letting him use, not I have one of my own, but that I owned that laptop, and that if I needed to take it away, I actually haven't ever taken it away, but if I need to restrict it or have him come away from it, then I could do so. That's not violating his property rights. So it's kind of, and that's actually, I mentioned that early on, right, when he was like 2, and now he's 9, and then that's still, I haven't needed. I'm not talking about how he's turning out or not. He's a great kid, but separately from that, which is kind of subjective, I haven't had to like introduce new principles or do any kind of ad hoc reason, like meaning I just come up with some BS, to justify why I'm making him do something outside of those 2 things. And it was kind of cool. I was able to say to him recently, I said, and he agreed. The cool thing was he agreed with this, like you could tell, like genuinely. I was like, Mommy and I care a lot about, like, not just about how you'll turn out in like that you're prepared for the future. We're kind of talking about how he has to learn stuff and take some time to learn, which he doesn't really enjoy doing often each day, or he might enjoy while he's doing it, but he doesn't want to do it often. So, but I say, like, Mommy and I, we also care about how you feel, like practically. I said a lot of parents, and he sees this with other kids, they don't really care that, like, take into account. They might care in theory, but they don't take into account very much how a kid feels like about their enjoyment or kind of day-to-day sort of happiness. They're more like looking at like the big picture and and like what's going to help them or hurt them or be better for them. Whereas we really do try to balance it out with just what he likes, in the moment, and not constantly, not letting him do this or that because theoretically it's bad for his health or his eyesight or he needs to play more sports, or whatever. Yeah, I try to push him to do things that are good for his health and generally good, but again, we balance it with just what's nice for him. And he agreed, he felt that. And that was cool because it really mitigates, like he tends to, not cooperate with things. But there's something kind of great about him affirming that he recognized that, because for him reasons matter, and it keeps, anyway, he kind of works. That's kind of random, but all right. Great. Okay, well, we get so many incorrect ideas translated to our minds from authority figures. Yeah, but again, it's a puzzle because we also get a lot of correct ideas. Like we notice the incorrect ones, but there's a ton of correct ideas, right? Like a ton of the stuff that the New York Times would have printed today would basically be accurate, or at least aspects of it would be accurate, right? A ton of stuff that the government wants us to do is also basically better for both us and society, and and reasonable, right? There plenty about government and its fundamental existence is not reasonable and it's wrong, but again, it doesn't mean like Hitler had a ton of beliefs that were probably accurate, right? Like it's so forth. So it can't just be, we can't just like think by rebellion. So we need to be careful of that. That's why, again, it's so important to have a method that works, that we apply, and that we only use our suspicion of authority and mainstream media and so forth to ask questions, but not as an excuse to like people, when I was saying about thehill.com, as commenters, they'll basically be in essence saying like, well, who can tell the difference between Russia and Ukraine? And you'd think that these were like Putin bots, but a lot of them look like actual people. And and they're like, well, how do you believe the news and this? And it's like, all right, if you can't tell the difference between Russia and Ukraine, then come on, there's something going wrong with a process somewhere. Okay, excellent. Great. Okay, excellent. I've at least addressed these 4 things, and these 4 things are accurately understanding them will lead you to the correct, kind of understanding of evolution, what's absurd, what isn't, and it'll kind of help you kind of step back when a evolutionist is saying something that seems to make sense. Then now you might be able to identify where it's getting blurred over. Is it a state dependence issue? They'll say things like, well, of course, you don't open a combination lock. We're not saying you open it all at once by chance. We're saying that you open one and then that's stored, right? The whole idea is that you make an improvement, right, of evolutionists. The whole concept that they use to defend their theory is you make an improvement and it's stored by natural selection. Then you make another improvement and it's stored. But we went through what that actually means is that there's a one amino acid change to a protein based on the DNA code, and then that has to wipe out the whole gene pool. That's actually what it means for an improvement to be stored. The minute we do anything less than wiping out the whole gene pool, we're basically just end up back at, well, it just happened by total chance with no natural selection, right? They'll constantly kind of wiggle out of things by forgetting about natural selection and just, oh, well, that could happen. Yeah, and so, but the idea of just having massive instant changes in organisms through massively large mutations is evolutionists themselves. That just kind of, now there's no theory anymore. Now you're just coming up with something that, again, and then if you just understand the science and what we can see it from history and what happens now, that just isn't going on, right? If that was the case, you just breed bacteria and all kinds of things would pop out. At least multicellular organisms would pop out, right? If you simulated hundreds of millions of years worth of evolution, but it never does. And we can see scientifically why that isn't going to happen. There's mechanisms that prevent copying errors in DNA. That's why it's like not good to have a bunch of radiation. What does radiation do? It messes up DNA. It causes too many mutations, right? That's bad. And it's not, you don't get the X-Men, right? You don't get like 100 dead people and one superhero. You just get 100 dead people, right? In Chernobyl, no X-Men came out of that, just sickness and death, or Hiroshima aftermath. Obviously, the explosion would have just killed people, but the radiation afterwards, right? When you go to the dentist's office and they cover you, not that they need to for that small amount, but it's not that they're keeping you from 1 out of 100 chance of becoming Wolverine, right? Or Professor X, or something like that. It's just not. This doesn't work that way scientifically, and evolutionists affirm that. That's why they have the theory with natural selection. But they'll bounce back and forth. When you criticize natural selection, they'll be more about this. When you criticize this, they'll say, oh no, of course you have natural selection. It stores progress. It makes so much sense until you actually look at it. Well, if it stores progress, I don't understand. There's cockroaches, they do great. So how is it? It's not progress, right? Progress is more grandkids, period. That's all that progress is. Again, it's that equivocation. Progress becomes, oh, that's cooler. Oh, that's another tool. That's another ability. Another ability is not progress. Only more grandkids is progress. And it's only going to get stored if you wipe out the whole gene pool. Otherwise, you have the problem of multiplying 0.8. And I only have spent so much time, but if you keep on thinking about that yourself, it does work out that way. You can always blur and confuse yourself and think otherwise, but the more clarity you get, the less evolution you get, except for, micro or whatever. Jarvis says, that's really good, David. I've discussed property rights with my kids, but it's always when they're fighting. That's really funny. Yeah, no, I did it like early and kind of in a framing and in a way that he could see benefited him, you know, and explain things. And so that worked out well. Police and offense, that's funny, right? Yeah. And guns, by the way. Yeah, that's a huge thing with school and evolutionary theory. To me, it slipped through, and I did not look further because, and you can't look into everything. I'm sure I have plenty of beliefs still about, you know, random stuff in history or scientifically that are false, or at least some, you know, plenty or some or what. How do you look into everything? So again, when I say it's a stupid theory, I just mean that it's the kind of thing where it's like I'm saying it's stupid to think that if you're betting 100, if you're going to Vegas at 100 to 1 odds, and you have a statistician or a person who's an expert on that topic telling everyone that of course you're going to get rich, then somewhere there's stupidity there, right? So, you know, of course I'm not trying to be insulting to anyone, except for, you know, the experts. It didn't look further because it basically did not believe that something like that could slip through. Right, exactly. It's kind of a shocking for something that big to slip through. There's something shocking about it. It gave me a huge paradigm shift to see both the professors at it, to see when I would ask them questions, it's not that they couldn't answer, they couldn't start to answer, if that makes any sense. And then watching kids kind of like zombily, you know, think it made sense. We're not clear about how to check stuff yet. Excellent, guys. All right, well, thanks. A lot of participation today, a lot of attendance. I'm glad there's such interest for the topic. I'm fascinated by it myself. I think I'll jump right into relationships next time we do a webinar. Probably maybe in 2 weeks. Next week's Easter. So check in and assume it'll be in 2 weeks, but I'll announce if it won't be if I need some time to prepare or something. But yeah, I mean, the stuff I talk about, I know. I just try to prepare mostly organization, and that mostly doesn't work anyway. So that's my thing in preparing. I work on it a whole bunch, and then, you know, who knows. Excellent. That's great, Jarvis. Thanks, guys, a ton. And I'll talk to y'all. Awesome, stunning, great. Glad and unique. You can comment on this one on YouTube if you want and say like, wow, I learned a lot from this, or, you know, or unique stuff I hadn't seen other places, things like that, you know, if you would. Awesome, brilliant, great. I'm glad, Lawrence, that's great, because you came in wanting to try to see where you kind of trusted that I had something, and, you know, you respected me, but you felt the evolution as well. All right, guys, take care, and I'll see you soon.